The first time I saw the gap, I thought I was looking at the wrong yard. My fence, a 6-foot cedar privacy barrier I installed 2 years ago, didn't just have damage. It was gone. Not broken. Not partially removed.
Gone.
A clean 20-foot stretch ripped straight out along the side boundary between my property and the HOA's community access strip. For a second, I genuinely wondered if I'd missed some scheduled utility work. Then I saw the tire tracks. Heavy equipment. Deep impressions cutting across my grass. And wooden posts, my posts, stacked neatly like debris on the HOA side. That's when I knew. This wasn't maintenance. This was intentional. I walked the entire property, line slowly. Every other section stood intact. Just that one strip removed, the exact area bordering the narrow path the HOA had long claimed was a future emergency access lane.
Claimed.
Not documented. I pulled out my phone and opened my security app. 2 days earlier, 9:42 a.m. A contractor truck backed into the side of my yard. 3 men stepped out. Behind them, walking confidently with a clipboard in hand, the HOA president. Or, as everyone in the neighborhood called her privately, Karen. She pointed at my fence, spoke briefly to the crew, and within minutes, they began dismantling it. No knocking, no notice, no permission. I fast-forwarded through the footage. She stood there the entire time, arms crossed, watching like a project manager overseeing approved work. Approved by who?
Certainly not me.
I drove straight to the HOA clubhouse. She was already there. When I walked in, she didn't even look surprised. "I was expecting you," she said calmly. "You tore out my fence." She smiled, not friendly, not apologetic. Professional. "We exercised our access rights." "You don't have access rights." She slid a printed document across the desk. Highlighted. Community Easement Provision, Section 8C. I scanned it quickly. It referenced emergency ingress and egress corridors within subdivision boundaries. I looked up. My parcel isn't part of the HOA subdivision. Her smile tightened slightly. It's within the mapped grid. Mapped grid is an ownership. She leaned back in her chair. "This is for community safety." "No," I replied evenly. "It's for convenience." Because I knew exactly what this was about. 3 months earlier, the HOA had approved construction of a new pool house behind the clubhouse. The only efficient way for contractors to bring equipment in? Through that narrow strip beside my property. But the fence blocked it. Instead of asking, she removed it. "You had no right to touch my property," I said. She tapped the document again. "You signed HOA acknowledgement when you purchased." "No," I corrected. "I declined membership at closing." Her expression flickered, barely. "That's not what our records indicate." "I don't care what your records indicate." The room grew quiet. Board members seated along the wall avoided eye contact. She spoke again, slower this time. "If you resist community improvements, you may face penalties." Penalties. For protecting my own boundary. I left without another word. Because arguing with someone who believes paperwork equals power is pointless unless you have better paperwork. Back home, I reviewed my closing file. There it was. Stamped and recorded. Property exempt from HOA governance per annexation exclusion. My lot had been carved out before the expansion about 5 years ago. The subdivision surrounded me on 3 sides. But legally, I stood alone, which meant she didn't just overstep. She trespassed. I called the contractor company listed on the truck. "Who authorized fence removal at my address?" A pause. "The HOA president." "Did she provide written consent from the homeowner?" Another pause. "We assumed she had it." Assumption. That word again. I stepped outside and looked at the open strip where my fence once stood. Without it, anyone could walk straight through my yard. Contractors. Neighbors. Strangers. She didn't just remove wood. She removed a boundary. And boundaries matter, especially when someone believes they don't apply to you. That night, I installed temporary steel stakes and caution tape. Not as a solution, as a statement. Because this wasn't about cedar panels. It was about control. She believed access was hers by default. She believed authority extended as far as she wanted it to. She believed I would argue loudly and then give up quietly. She was wrong, because while she was focused on forcing access through my land, I was about to focus on who actually owned the land behind hers. The next morning, I didn't call her. I went to the county. There's something about fluorescent-lit government offices that calms me. Everything is boring. Everything is documented. Everything either exists on record, or it doesn't. And when someone tears out your fence claiming access rights, records matter. I requested the full subdivision plat map, including all easements, rights-of-way, and amendments filed over the last 10 years. The clerk printed a stack thick enough to make a point. I spread the documents across the counter.
Parcel lines.
Utility corridors. Drainage easements. Emergency vehicle access lanes. And there, highlighted in faded yellow from an old amendment, was the strip Karen claimed gave her authority. Except it didn't touch my property. It ran behind the clubhouse, parallel to my lot. Close enough to be convenient. Not close enough to be legal. I traced my parcel boundary carefully. Lot 18B.
Exempt.
Outlined cleanly in red ink from the annexation filing 5 years ago. No shared easement. No ingress provision. No HOA control. Which meant her Section 8C argument depended entirely on one assumption. That my land was part of the subdivision grid. It wasn't. The horseshoe-shaped neighborhood wrapped around me, but legally I was an island. And islands don't grant access unless they choose to. On my way out, I asked one more question. Who owns the land directly behind the clubhouse? The clerk pulled up the parcel number. Not the HOA. Not the city. A private owner. An older man named Harold Jensen. The same narrow strip Karen had been trying to use through my yard was meant to connect to that rear parcel, the one they didn't own. I stared at the screen a second longer. How long has he owned it? 32 years, the clerk replied. Interesting. Because 3 months ago, during a heated board meeting about the new pool house, I remembered Karen mentioning pending access arrangements. At the time, I assumed she meant city permits. Now I realized what she meant. She didn't have access. She was trying to create it. And my fence was in the way. I drove straight to the address listed for Harold Jensen. Small farmhouse. Weathered mailbox. Neatly trimmed hedges. He answered the door himself. Mid-70s. Sharp eyes. Cautious posture. Mr. Jensen? Yes. My name's Daniel. I live in the subdivision behind your property. He didn't look surprised. They've been calling you too? That told me everything. They tried to buy your strip, I said. He nodded once. Offered under market value. And I declined. Of course he did. Because that narrow strip wasn't useless. It was leverage. Without it, the HOA's new development project had no efficient access route. They needed either his land or mine. And mine was easier to bully. Have they contacted you again recently? I asked. Last week, he replied. Mentioned alternative acquisition strategies. Alternative acquisition strategies. That sounded like Karen. Aggressive when polite negotiation fails. I explained what happened with my fence. His jaw tightened. They don't own that corridor, he said flatly. I know. We stood in silence for a moment. Then I asked the question carefully. If someone made you a fair offer for that strip, would you consider selling? He studied me. Not suspicious. Evaluating. I would, he said finally, to the right buyer. That evening, I returned home and stood at the open gap where my fence once stood. Beyond it, the clubhouse roof peeked over trees. Workers had already begun staging materials for the new pool house. Temporary gravel lined what used to be my grass. They were acting as if access was settled, as if resistance was temporary, as if pressure would work. But pressure only works when someone has no options.
I did.
Because while Karen believed she could force a corridor through my property, the real key to her project sat quietly behind the clubhouse, owned by someone she underestimated, and within reach of someone she thought she could intimidate. She tore out my fence to claim access. She had no idea that the land she truly needed was about to change hands. I didn't rush. That was the most important part. People like Karen rely on urgency. They create pressure, noise, visible momentum, contractors moving, materials delivered, schedules announced, so resistance feels pointless. But leverage grows in silence. 3 days after visiting Mr. Jensen, I returned with a folder. Not emotional, not confrontational.
Prepared.
Inside were comparable land sales within 5 miles, recent zoning assessments, and a written purchase offer well above what the HOA had reportedly offered him. I knocked.
He invited me in.
We sat at a small wooden table near the window overlooking his back acreage, the same narrow strip the HOA desperately needed. I won't insult you with a low number, I said, sliding the offer across the table. This reflects development value, not farmland value. He adjusted his glasses and read slowly. No reaction at first. Then a subtle nod. They offered nearly 40% less than this, he said. I figured. They also implied eminent domain could become complicated. I exhaled quietly. HOAs don't have eminent domain authority. Cities do. She had tried to bluff him. That told me something critical. She was overextended. They can't take it, I said plainly. Not without municipal action. And this isn't public infrastructure. He leaned back. Why do you want it? I held his gaze. Because right now they think access through my land is inevitable. I'd prefer to own the inevitability. He smiled at that. Not amused. Respectful. We negotiated for an hour. Not aggressively.
Strategically.
I increased the offer slightly to cover transfer costs and property taxes for the year. In return, he agreed to a swift closing timeline. 7 business days. No contingencies beyond clear title. When I left his house, I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. Because ownership isn't loud. It's documented. Meanwhile, at the subdivision, the pool house framing had begun. Temporary fencing lined the construction path, cutting directly through the gap where my fence once stood. Workers moved confidently. Equipment rolled through daily. Karen stood on site more often now, clipboard in hand, issuing directions. She believed resistance had faded. She was wrong. On closing day, I met Mr. Jensen at the title office. We signed quietly. Transferred funds. Recorded the deed immediately with the county. By 2:17 p.m., the narrow strip behind the clubhouse belonged to me.
Not the HOA.
Not Karen.
Me.
That same afternoon, I walked the new boundary line personally. From the rear of my original property, all the way along the newly acquired strip. It connected perfectly. A continuous corridor under single ownership.
Mine.
The next morning, I installed something simple. Bright orange survey flags. Not on my original lot. On the newly purchased land, directly behind the clubhouse. By noon, I received the call. Her voice was tight. What exactly are you doing? Surveying my property. That parcel is under active construction access. No, I corrected calmly. It's under my ownership. Silence. Then sharper. You can't obstruct a community development. I'm not obstructing anything. I'm clarifying boundaries. Her breathing changed. You knew we needed that strip. Yes. And you bought it to interfere. I bought it because it was available. The truth is powerful when it's simple. You're being unreasonable, she snapped. No, I said evenly. I'm exercising property rights. She tried one last angle. We already committed funds based on anticipated access. That sounds like a planning issue. The call ended abruptly. Within an hour, construction halted. Workers stood around waiting for direction. Equipment idled. Because now the only viable access route required crossing land she no longer had permission to use. She tore out my fence, claiming necessity. She forgot necessity cuts both ways. And when someone creates pressure assuming you'll fold, they rarely anticipate you'll acquire the pressure point instead. I didn't need to argue anymore. I didn't need to threaten legal action. I owned the corridor. And ownership doesn't negotiate under intimidation. It defines the terms. By sunset, A temporary barrier went up at the edge of my new parcel.
Clean.
Legal.
Documented.
Karen thought tearing down a fence would force my compliance. Instead, it forced my strategy. Because when someone claims access as a right, the smartest move isn't always blocking them. Sometimes it's buying the road they plan to walk on. Construction stopped the morning after I recorded the deed. Not because she wanted it to, because it had to. The equipment that had been rolling confidently through the torn gap in my fence now sat idle. Framing materials leaned half-assembled behind the clubhouse. Workers stood in small groups, checking their phones, waiting for instructions that weren't coming. I watched from my yard as Karen stormed across the gravel path toward the newly placed survey flags on the land behind the clubhouse. My land. She didn't call first this time. She came in person. "You're obstructing an approved community project," she said without greeting. I kept my tone even.
No.
"I'm preventing unauthorized access across my property." That strip has always functioned as access. Functioned, I repeated. Not documented. Her jaw tightened. "You purchased that parcel specifically to interfere with HOA development." "I purchased it because it was for sale." "You knew we needed it." "Yes." There it was again, the quiet confirmation that this had never been about emergency access. It was about convenience, budget, timeline,
And control.
She shifted tactics. "The board can vote to impose a temporary construction easement on land you don't own?" Her silence lasted half a second too long. Then she tried authority again. "You're inside subdivision limits." "No," I corrected calmly. "My original parcel is exempt. The new parcel isn't even zoned residential under your HOA declaration." I had checked.
Twice.
The new strip was classified as agricultural transitional land, not subject to HOA covenants because it was never annexed, which meant she had exactly zero jurisdiction over it. Behind her, a contractor approached nervously. "Ma'am, we can't continue staging materials without written access." She waved him off. "I'm handling it," but she wasn't. Because this time, the paperwork wasn't on her side. By noon, I received a formal letter from the HOA attorney. Polite. Measured. Requesting temporary access negotiations. No threats. No citations of Section 8C. Just negotiation. That told me everything. When people stop citing bylaws and start asking politely, they know they're exposed. I drafted a response the same afternoon. Clear terms. Written acknowledgement that my original fence removal was unauthorized. Full reimbursement for fence replacement and lawn damage. Formal recorded easement request, not implied access. Fair market compensation for temporary construction use. Defined time limits with penalties for overstay. And one more clause. All access to be supervised and insured, with daily restoration obligations. If they wanted the corridor, they would pay for it. Not just financially, structurally. Because easements, once recorded, don't disappear. They become permanent. And permanent decisions require leverage. The emergency board meeting that evening was heated. I wasn't inside, but the raised voices carried through the clubhouse windows. By the next morning, an email went out to residents. Construction temporarily paused pending access clarification. Clarification. Such a clean word for miscalculation. Karen requested a private meeting with me the following day. We met at a neutral cafe outside the subdivision. No board members. No clipboard. No performance. She looked tired. "This didn't have to escalate," she began. "You escalated it when you tore out my fence. That was within our rights."
No.
It wasn't. She hesitated just slightly. "We relied on outdated parcel data." That was as close to admission as she would come. "You relied on assumption," I corrected. She leaned forward. "What do you want?" Simple question, but powerful, because it meant she finally understood who controlled the outcome. "I want acknowledgement," I said. "And compensation. For land we intended to benefit the community with." "You intended to benefit a project you approved without securing access first." Her silence confirmed it. They had budgeted the pool house assuming either Mr. Jensen would cave, or I would. Neither happened. You're jeopardizing property values. She tried one last time. No, I said calmly. I'm protecting mine. The meeting ended without agreement. But something had shifted. She no longer spoke from authority. She spoke from need. And need changes the balance entirely. Back home, I stood at the newly installed temporary barrier across my acquired strip. Bright, visible, legal. Not aggressive. Just clear. She tore out my fence believing access was inevitable. Now she was discovering something uncomfortable. Access isn't claimed. It's granted. And only by the person who owns the ground beneath it. 3 days after our cafe meeting, the HOA attorney called. Not Karen. Not a board member. An attorney. Measured tone. Professional cadence. We're prepared to discuss your conditions. That sentence alone confirmed the shift. Not demand. Not enforce.
Discuss.
Because when ownership is clear, authority becomes optional. We met at a conference room downtown. Present were the attorney, 2 subdued board members, and Karen, noticeably quieter than usual. I brought copies of everything. My original deed exemption. County records for the newly acquired parcel. Photos of fence removal. Contractor invoice estimates. A proposed easement draft. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't posture. Paperwork doesn't need emotion. The attorney spoke first. The association acknowledges there may have been a misunderstanding regarding boundary authority. Misunderstanding. A polite word for trespass. And, I asked calmly, we are willing to reimburse fence replacement and lawn restoration. Full cost, I replied, plus a written acknowledgement that removal occurred without homeowner authorization. Karen shifted in her seat. That language could expose the board to liability. It already is. Silence. Then the attorney nodded slowly. We can draft something suitable.
Good.
Because documentation matters more than apologies. Next came the real issue. Temporary access. They needed 12 weeks to complete the pool house construction. I adjusted the draft. 8 weeks. Escrow deposit held in advance for potential damage. Daily access hours defined. No weekend operation without written notice. And one critical clause. Automatic termination of easement upon project completion. No implied renewal. The attorney reviewed the document carefully. These terms are firm. Yes. Karen finally spoke. You're profiting off community necessity. No, I corrected. I'm charging market value for private land use. Big difference. She looked frustrated but cornered. Because she knew they had no alternative route. Mr. Jensen wasn't selling to them. And city rerouting would cost 6 figures and delay permits for months. They needed the corridor.
And I owned it.
After 2 hours of back-and-forth revisions, the agreement was signed. Recorded.
Filed.
Legal. When construction resumed the following week, it looked different. Organized. Controlled. Contractors checked in daily. Equipment stayed within marked boundaries. Restoration crews followed behind heavy machinery. Because when access is earned, not assumed, behavior changes. 2 months later, the pool house stood complete. Final inspection passed. Temporary fencing removed. The easement automatically dissolved per recorded terms. And something else changed. Karen didn't run in the next HOA election. She cited personal reasons. But the neighborhood knew. Leadership built on intimidation doesn't survive exposure. Word spread quietly, not about revenge. About leverage. About reading deeds before signing anything. About understanding where HOA authority stops. A week after project completion, I rebuilt my original fence. Stronger posts. Reinforced brackets. Clear boundary. This time, I installed small metal property markers at intervals along both parcels. Visible.
Permanent.
Because fences aren't just wood. They're statements. Months later, I saw Karen once at the grocery store. No clipboard. No confident stride. Just another resident. She glanced at me briefly, then looked away. Not angry. Not apologetic. Just aware. Because she understood something now. Tearing out my fence wasn't a display of power. It was a gamble. And she gambled, without securing the ground beneath her. She assumed access was hers by default. She assumed I would resist emotionally instead of strategically. She assumed pressure would force compliance. Instead, it forced calculation. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I didn't escalate publicly. I purchased quietly, negotiated firmly, documented everything, and let ownership speak. In the end, I didn't block development. I defined it. She tore out my fence, claiming access. Weeks later, I owned the only path she truly needed. And once you control the path, you control the pace. Not through aggression, not through volume, but through something far more powerful: title.